There you go. There we go. All right.
All right, so we thought it would be fun to just bring some humor into this white fragility conversation. So what is white fragility? Can I give you a piece of it at all?
I mean, I don't know, I don't want to answer all the questions, but yeah, no, I mean, I notice it come up a lot because I talk about this sort of thing pretty much all of the time in my social settings, and there's a lot of people who really don't want to think about it because, I don't know, I feel like I've thought about this a lot and why people are so defensive and why this concept is so fragile, and I feel like it comes from a place of people don't want to accept that it's real or that there are these problems that we have because that would also mean accepting the fact that they benefit from them and, being normal, human beings, they have empathy for that and don't want to have to deal with the incredibly awful implications that this is real and that all these people have been and continue to be hurt by a system which also benefits them. So they don't want to accept it because that would mean accepting all of this awful pain that it's also caused. It's I feel like that's sort of like when you bring it up, no one wants to talk about it because it's like, well, I'm a C race, we're totally past that. I don't have to address anything negative because we elected Obama, so everything's fine now. And so any reminder was really.
Thank you.
I think part of it has to do also with being white. You don't want to be part of the problem, even as active as you may be. It's that you just have to admit you're part of the problem because there's stuff that you're taught through society and your parents without even being outright racist, but it's racist and it's something that you just have to come to terms with. People don't want to do that because it's not their fault. But I don't do that. I'm a good person. I support everyone. Be like, well, actually you don't because you do these subtle things that you don't notice.
Yeah. And we live in the system.
Yeah.
In this culture.
Yeah.
Sandy.
Yeah, I think for me, one of my emotions was fear. It's like I open up this can of worms and it's, holy crap, there's no bottom to it. It's like, just I start scratching the surface and learn a little bit and then there's so much to learn in it. So it's like, wow, so much work and how do I do it? How do I, it's like, I don't know how to maintain an equilibrium and a grace within that, and I don't know why I feel like I should, but I do. So it's like, I kind of feel like I'm failing before I even start, and it's just a lot of work.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that equilibrium, so thanks for bringing up that concept. Yes.
Robin DiAngelo, who's the writer that Tony mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, has done a lot of good work on individualism and the culture of individualism is such a strong ideology in U.S. culture and how it contributes because we think of ourselves as unique snowflakes, and it makes it hard for us to see socialization and to see systemic forces everywhere. And we think, well, I know in my own heart that I am a good person and that I don't harbor racist hatred, so how can you be telling me that I'm part of this?
Yeah. Great, thank you. So this is getting into the Robin DiAngelo's work. So, we live in an environment, I chose especially this very safe picket fence with a bicycle giving us that Portland piece. But we live in a community where we're isolated, we're insulated really from race-based stress, right, as white people. We also have expectations for racial comfort, right? You've probably heard, if you've come to Whiteness History Month, about the difference between safety and comfort, right? And we're really talking about comfort, right? We are, most of us, safe here having a conversation about race, but that word safety is often raised. And it lowers our ability to tolerate racial stress.
Yes.
So yeah, this is her definition, Robin DiAngelo's definition. Fragility is the state in which even the minimum amount of racial stress, right? So getting the post on Facebook, right, or the email, right, becomes intolerable and it triggers a range of defensive moves. And there's a lack of stamina. And we're going to talk about stamina, right? We don't have the stamina to engage in these conversations, right? We're going to try to fly through some of these slides. So, typical white responses include both emotions and behaviors. So, and you've seen these, right? The anger, fear, and guilt we talked about here, right? And you hear that the guilt, right? People talk about guilt a lot. And I first read James Baldwin talked about, I don't have time for your guilt, right? And quite a long time ago. I don't have time for your guilt. Basically, we have a responsibility to clean this up. Tim Wise talks about this now, lots of people do. So moving from guilt to responsibility, right? And was it you that said that as well? Others of you have said that today. And then behaviors, right, that might respond, argumentation, right, arguing, especially on the internet, right? Because it's so much easier on the internet, right? The anonymity of the internet, right? To say what's on your mind in the rudest fashion possible. Silence, right, is a huge one, right? And you all have seen this, it's something that I feel like I live with as a faculty member here, is the overall silence around this month, right? And I'd love it if you sit there, actually. I'm just saying. Oh, are you stretching your back? Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Silence and tears, right? Crying, people crying when there's a conversation about racism or whiteness, or just simply leaving the conversation, right? So this is the way in which, typically white people respond to this conversation, right? And so they simply won't come to this event, right? It's just much easier. And I have sent communications to a lot of my friends about this event, and there's just a lot of silence. Mm-hmm. And it's overwhelming. It's deafening, really, the amount of silence around this. And it's so telling, isn't it? So telling. Yeah. So disappointing. Yeah, disappointing. But so anyway, these behaviors, both privilege and fragility, right? The privilege to not engage in the conversation, right? To be able to walk away, to say, I'm not going to go to White History Month today because it's too much for me, right? That's a privilege, right? That we get to turn off this conversation when we want to. And the fragility, right? Our feelings about it that we're talking about here function to reinstate the white racial equilibrium that DiAngelo talks about. So there's this way in which we are always she talks about this, reestablishing our equilibrium, right? We want to feel that comfort, right? And so these conversations really disrupt our equilibrium, and we simply get to do this, right? We get to walk away, we get to argue, we get to cry, we get to do all these things to reestablish, right, the equilibrium. And it happens all the time, doesn't it? Right? And it prevents the conversation from happening.
So we're talking about triggers. What are the things that lead to people doing these things? And it's, I think it's important too to, we're not necessarily demonizing people's feelings. You're going to feel these things. I think the bigger spirit behind our presentation is really about, let's ask ourselves why. Why am I feeling this? Why did that thing, why did that trigger, why did suggesting that my viewpoint comes from a racialized frame of reference make me upset? Why did it make me cry? Why did it make me angry? And I think that's why it's kind of useful to kind of look at the emotional component of this fragility thing, because people's, the minute you start to discount people's feelings of anything, you're getting into a gray area that's pushing them away, you know? And so to suggest someone's feelings are illegitimate, I think is a dangerous tack to take. More so, let's say, that's a real feeling you're having. Why do you think you're having that, you know? Because I think a lot of these triggers that are up here, you know, people are talking directly about their racial perspectives and things like that. You know, as a white person, you know, I've found myself in difficult, you know, emotional points around all of these things. And a lot of the why is because I grew up in a segregated city in the Midwest, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you know. And I didn't have the capacity or the experience or the lens to interrogate my own perspective. So like, when I was introduced to these things, I was just like, It helped me understand what was going on with my heart and my head around these issues a little bit better, and then you can start to see the forest from, you know, from the trees. So that's, I feel like, you know, people of color choosing not to protect the racial feelings of white people. I know that that's always a huge issue when we're talking about fragility, because I've heard it time and again from white people saying, well, what about my feelings? And that's hard to argue. Yeah, what about your feelings? You know, you're having them. They're legitimate. So I think it's really important, once again, reiterate my point. Let's talk about why you're feeling that. Let's start there. Let's start on the feelings.
I also feel like we touched on this in the Buddhist approach to whiteness night, which was part of my racial identity as being white. It's never occurred to me that my feelings don't matter, or that I don't have a space to say, announce how I feel to everybody. And that's a part of my learning in this process has been to be able to just discern when it's appropriate for me to express my feelings and when I need to just listen and absorb. And if my feelings become overwhelming, which they do sometimes, then it's my responsibility to either remove myself and cry it out or whatever, but that I don't get to take away from the topic because I'm having a feeling about it. It's not about me. And that was a challenge for me to it still is, because I have all these feelings that are natural. I think I'm not afraid of the feelings themselves, but having to know when it's appropriate to express them and to whom and in what space. And so I feel like this is an important room to be able to do that.
Yeah, and you know, just to kind of connect 2 points here, it's even more difficult to have the conversation in a culture that's individualist, where that's your problem, not my problem. You know, and you know, once again, it's another reason why, as culture, Americans don't really share feelings. You know, think about how that serves any dominant narrative when people don't talk about how they feel about a thing. Does it serve us, or what does it serve? So, yeah, there's a second page of triggers. There's a lot of possible triggers. So, if you didn't know, you can now. Yeah. The impact versus intention conversation. How many people have been in that? You know, that's not what I intended. No, but what you did really hurt. And so let's talk about, once again, the feelings. Access unequal between racial groups, and that's another thing. If people are unaware of the systemic nature of racism, if they locate it in individual behavior as opposed to like, how does the system, you know, make a difference, and how does the system show up as being racist and things like that. And if you're not someone who's looked into like the disparity of arrest numbers or execution numbers, or the disparity in healthcare, or in hiring, or in leadership, and all the things that we can actually use to triangulate how racism is systemic, you're gonna have a difficult challenge, you know, the challenge to meritocracy. So that's the thing I loved about putting these points up, is it kind of notes, you know, what is being called into challenge in those moments to lead to these feelings. So does this make sense? Have you ever found who's seen something on these lists that you've reacted to at some point in your life? Yeah.
This is all from D'Angelo.
Yeah. So can look at that.
All right, just because we're running out of time.
Oh,
Go ahead.
yeah, please.
Just, you said they weren't gonna come. There's one other one that just keeps coming up for me that maybe is included in all those. Is I feel so betrayed by history, by education, by America. So it's like, it's not a challenge to like supremacy, it's a challenge to like, you've been lied to like for 200 years, and it's just like shocking.
Yeah. Yeah, the roads.
I don't think that is on that list because that was triggers for white people, but that, I hear you. Yeah.
Well, I feel like that's something that you hit, like, once you start, like, looking at interrogating these things, and you start to get to that next step, which I think is more leaning towards the Helms model that we're heading for. So
Yes.
you'll probably find yourself represented
Yes.
there, but thank you. I think that's really important to the conversation.
All right, so just quickly, I know we could spend an hour on this slide, so we're just gonna kind of skip through it really fast. So obviously, we live in segregated communities in the United States, and so whites have received very little information or authentic information about racism and are unprepared to critically think about racism. Universal and individualism. So we do both really, and they are seemingly contradictory, but white people see themselves as the norm, right? And so there's this universality around being white, and so we have a trouble then because of we think we live similar lives, right? And we don't, of course, and so we have difficulty understanding that the experience for a person of color might be different, okay? But at the same time, we have this contradictory discourse, which is around individualism, right? So I'm an individual, I'm different, I'm not like those white people, right? So it's this, we do both, even though they are seemingly contradictory. And then entitlement to racial comfort. We've talked about this a little bit today, but there's this need, this insistence, right, for racial comfort. So it prevents us, right, from moving forward, right, because we think we deserve that, right? Racial arrogance is around, what that's really speaking to is this idea that we know anything about race or what people are experiencing. And actually D'Angela writes about like when she talks to people about what she does, like people they think they know. Like they think they know just because they're human, they could speak about racism or somebody else's racial experience. So there's this kind of racial arrogance, right? That there's nothing to learn, honestly, right? And then racial belonging. Whites enjoy a deeply internalized central presence, right, in our society, right? So we have a largely unconscious sense of belonging, right? And let's see, everywhere we look, our image is reflected back to us. Psychic freedom, because we don't have to carry this burden of race and racism like every hour. We are free to think about and focus on other things. Not true for our colleagues and brothers and sisters of color. And then finally, the white supremacy messaging. We receive constant messages that we're better and more important than people of color. These messages operate in multiple ways. Obviously, the media. But even back to Adam and Eve, and lots of white supremacist messaging from the beginning of our history, and as some of you mentioned, the whitewashing of our education, right, where we only learned about white people. All right, I think that kind of covers it very quickly.
So I was wondering if anybody would be willing to read the slide or read portion. We'll get 3 people. Anybody want to read the first part? Yeah.
In a white supremacist context, white identity in large part rests upon a foundation of superficial racial toleration and acceptance.
Whites who position themselves as liberal often opt to protect what they perceive as their moral reputations, rather than recognize or change their participation in systems of inequity and domination.
Yeah, thanks.
In so responding, whites invoke the power to choose when, how, and how much to address or challenge racism.
And I think, I think we both want to put this up here because I think it kind of frames in a great way, like, what the situation is in Portland, largely, in terms of the racism of the Northwest and how it's exhibited. Yeah, because I don't know how many people of color I've heard say that they would, at least in the South, it's out in the open, and here in the North, it's not so much.
My grandfather, who, obviously he talked about, he thought a lot about that, and was very aware of it for himself, who was a Yankee, he was from Connecticut, but spent a lot of time in the South and moved out here. I heard, like my dad told me the way that he said it, and the more I learn, the more it's just seems like so apt. So he says that, whites are all racist. The difference is in the South, they hate the people and love the person, and in the North, they love the person and hate the people. And that idea of this insidious racism through colorblindness of I don't see race, you're just an individual to me, but those things that we are conditioned to believe are still there, but we refuse to speak about them. Whereas, you might be incredibly confused by someone who's says all these horribly racist things and bigoted and stereotypical things, but then they have a black coworker or someone that they know through some other way, and they're like, oh, him? No, he's just a good old boy. He's just totally not even, and it's such a different dynamic.
Yeah. Well, I know we want to roll into Helms model. I just want to kind of talk that. No, that's fine. You can go ahead. So this is, Tanya and I really love this in terms of being able to kind of measure that that process of where are we going with this? What are we doing with it?
So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the model because we're really running out of time. So we want to give you an opportunity to think of, have you all, how many of you have seen the Helms model? Okay. All right, so Helms' model of white identity is really about white people coming to terms with racism. That's what this model is about. And so I'm just going to fly through it a little bit, and then I'm going to give you an activity to do in pairs, and just so you can kind of feel the model a little bit. So contact or pre-encounter whites learn that being white is normal. Whites, and they internalize the messages of the dominant society, right? So this is pre-encounter. Disintegration or encounter is kind of when whites kind of realize or make, racism becomes visible really for the first time and there's initial discomfort, okay? And then reintegration is about this dance, that struggle, that trying to find that equilibrium. And where whites might distance themselves from the white collective, saying I'm an individual, I don't do those things, right? But also it's not, there's a tendency to slip backwards as well. So these are the first three. And I do want to say that models always look linear, but they're not. And we really would never, I find myself, the reason I love the model is because I find myself going through this. It's a circular spiral, right? And it's not this linear thing like you're going to see there's 6 stages. And it's not like, oh, we've suddenly arrived. So Helms' model continued. You want to take these 3 and I'll pass? Or
Sure.
I can pass. You want to pass out stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. So then the final 3 stages, pseudo-independence, beginning to understand, so this is clearly moving, right, evolving to understanding institutional and cultural racism, but yet not really sure what to do with it. Does that sound familiar maybe to anyone? Immersion is surrounding oneself with positive white anti-racist people and symbols and learning about white anti-racist history and identity. Is number 5, so kind of really delving into the white anti-racist philosophy. And then 6 is really separating from the values of white supremacy and being able to engage in anti-racism efforts with both people of color and with whites, right? So, this is kind of the evolution, if you will, of white identity. So Helms, and so you have, hopefully you're in pairs, or you can get in a pair.
There's a few things.
Yeah, and a 3 is fine, a 3 is fine. So what I'd like you to do is you have some quotes.
All right.
I will hand out the model, so you can take the model.
I have another if you want to split it in a pair or something.
Grab a pair.
This is the model.